So I have quite a few pages of introductory material for our panel. Maybe I can condense it, giving a little bit more informal. I wasn't quite sure how formal or informal would be. So my name is, well, we all know each other. My name is Dr. Peter Bahr. I'm associate professor here in the CSHPE, but it seems kind of silly to be saying that to this particular audience. I want to say a little bit about myself, my own research, my connection to this panel, and then I'll introduce each of the panelists in turn. So my research focuses on student pathways into, through, and out of post-secondary education, with a special focus on community colleges and other non-selective institutions. Some of my recent work is focused on STEM transfer pathways, our work together on STEM transfer pathways, labor market returns to community college education, both completion and non-completion, now students of non-traditional age, which is a difficult phrase because it means different things, different places, and now work on improving community college assessment and placement. How do we do a better job of helping students understand where they should begin in the curriculum? I joined the faculty here, and I'm just so pleased to be here in 2009. And it's moments like this when you have the alums coming in and former faculty, and you're like, what a great place to be. What a history to this institution and this center, and what a tremendous gift it is to be here as a faculty member, or a student, or as an alum. So, but prior to this, I was faculty at in sociology at Wayne State University, and then prior to that, I received my PhD in sociology at UC Davis, University of California, Davis. On my right here in the middle is Dr. Dr. Christopher Baldwin. He earned his doctorate from the program here as an alum in 2013, and was one of the folks that was here when I first joined, which is cool because I've met so many people today that I didn't know that were here prior to my arrival. His dissertation research focused on tensions in community colleges between maintaining open access and promoting student completion. Over the past 15 years, he's held a number of professional roles, many or most of which focused on the adoption of practices and policies that increase the likelihood that students will complete a post-secondary credential completion. His work, I did not know about this. I don't know how I didn't know about this. His work resulted in a book just this year, published this year, The Completion Agenda in Community Colleges, What It Is, Why It Matters, and Where It's Going.
Ooh. So you bought it? You're the one.
Is available. I looked it up. I'm going to get a copy myself as well. Among his recent professional roles, Dr. Baldwin was Associate Vice President at Jobs for the Future, JFF. And prior to that, he served as Executive Director and Founding Director of the Michigan Center for Student Success here at the Michigan Community College Association. Chris's right is Dr. Jillian Gross Fortgang. Dr. Fortgang, I want to say Dr. Gross.
Well, no, it's Gross Fortgang.
Gross Fortgang.
That's actually the whole last name.
The whole thing.
The whole thing is my really doozy of a last name that I'm really regretting these days.
That's right.
I'm trying to explain that one on the phone.
Dr. Gross Fortgang, my colleague Jillian, earned her doctorate just this summer in higher education administration. Amazing dissertation. I was fortunate to be on her committee and learned a ton. Her research focuses on organizational decision-making in American community colleges and their global counterparts. Her dissertation focused particularly on the evolution and implementation of the community college concept in India, where she had spent a considerable amount of time doing research. Just amazing work. Highly recommend. Professionally, she has taught high school, worked extensively in the nonprofit sector, and held a number of other positions. She now holds a position at Oakland Community College, assisting with their efforts to develop and implement sustainable strategies to promote student success related to academic partnerships and internalization. Excellent choice for this panel. To my immediate right is Dr. Vasti Torres. Dr. Torres joined our faculty here at CSHPE just this year, another exciting addition to the faculty. Her research focuses on the success of underrepresented students in higher education and is particularly known for how the identity development of Latino and Latina students can influence their college experience. Prior to the University of Michigan, Dr. Torres served as Dean of the College of Education at the University of Southern Florida. Prior to that, Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies and Director of the Center for Post-Secondary Research in the School of Education at Indiana University. So our focus today is on student success, and I think by nature and virtue of our panel, it happens to be heavily weighted towards community college student success, and I'm looking across the room and seeing a number of folks who I know are interested in community colleges. And to introduce this topic, I wanted to mention or frame it in terms of the complexity of understanding, studying, promoting, encouraging student success and completion in community colleges. And it's complicated by a number of factors. First is the diversity of goals that students bring to community colleges. Second, the diversity of ways that students engage in the community college environment and engage with these institutions. And third, by the diversity of needs and prior experiences that are present in the student body. And as a for instance here, I wanted to frame, Chris and I talked a bit about this, I want to frame two ends of the continuum from my own research, and then I'll turn over to our panel. On one end of the continuum, we have, I've done now a fair amount of work, and Chris and I have talked quite a bit about this group of students in community colleges that I call skills builders. So these are short duration, highly successful students. They're in the institution typically for one, not more than 2 semesters. They're extraordinarily successful in their coursework with respect to completion rates and grade point average, far more successful than other segments of the student body. They tend to concentrate in career and technical education coursework, and when they leave, we find that they realize meaningful earnings gains. In fact, this was not a PowerPoint-friendly environment, but you can actually see as you plot earnings that you add this trend of downward earnings, and then the skills builders enter the college, and immediately earnings turn and go the other way. Now, there's all sorts of ways we can interpret that, but certainly it appears that time in community college is proven fruitful for these students. You think, well, there couldn't be many of these students, right? But in fact, as we look across states, in California, it's 1 in 11 new students in the system. Many of these students, about a quarter in California, already have a baccalaureate degree when they come in. In Colorado, it's even more, actually. Recent work from Colorado, I was able to, in studying all the community college students in Colorado, I found 1 in 10 is a skills builder, fits this skills builder profile. In Michigan, where the reason for my research was limited to just 5 institutions of the 26, so in that sense, it's not representative of the whole state, and it tended to heavily focus on transfer-oriented institutions. Nevertheless, 1 in 14 here in Michigan is a skills builder among the 5 institutions that we studied, which is quite fascinating when you think about it. Students clearly being successful by all markers except what we think of as completion. In the career and technical education sector in particular, that segment of the courses that community colleges tend to offer, skills builders are anywhere from about a quarter to a third of all career and technical ed focused students. So you can imagine how challenging that makes it to measure the success of a career and technical education program when a quarter to a third of your students, or perhaps more, are not graduating and therefore not being counted under typical success metrics. At the other end of the continuum, in a study in California that I've been working on, I found that, and this is big now, follow these figures, 16% of students who pass Calculus 1 with a C or better, which is 13% of all students who attempt Calculus 1, leave the community college without a post-secondary credential and without transferring to a 4-year institution. So when we think about community college students, we often tend to, I think the discourse tends to steer towards developmental education. Certainly that is a big component of what community colleges offer, programmatically speaking. Nevertheless, as Jillian's work and my work overlapping around STEM pathways, we found that a very large segment of community college students participate in college-level STEM coursework, and in fact even get all the way into calculus. And here we see that a large fraction of the students who are not just taking Calculus 1 and perhaps not passing or struggling, but actually succeeding in it are leaving the institution without a credential, which is astounding. You dig a little bit deeper, you find that it's 15% of all students who pass general chemistry, which is, of course, an upper-level chemistry course, not even the lowest course necessary to qualify for physical science requirement, general ed requirement. 12% of all students who pass physics for scientists and engineers. 1. You dig a little closer, a little deeper into these students, you find that these students are not just taking one course. They're not just coming in and taking Calculus 1 or Gen Chem 1. In many cases, these students are taking a range of math and science courses. They're accumulating a very large number of credits over an extended period of time, and yet leaving with no credential. So these are the two ends of the continuum. Highly successful students, two ends of the continuum of highly successful students. Students who are advancing very far in the curriculum, accumulating many successfully completed courses, achieving high GPAs, and by all markers should be leaving a credential. And at the other end of the continuum, students who are clearly successful in what they're doing and yet leaving within a semester or two, again, with only 3 or 6 credits under their belt. So with that's quite a long frame, but a big frame to work in, hopefully. My suggestion to our panel was that we work in reverse alphabetical order. We might begin with Dr. Torres today.
Could be the first time I'm first to speak alphabetically, so it's kind of exciting. My work with community colleges is on 3 levels. You can't study Latino students without looking at community colleges, so I immediately began looking at them. I was also early in my career asked to be one of the evaluators for a Rural Community College Initiative, which was a national initiative funded by the Ford Foundation, and ended up doing 2 sets of evaluation for that initiative, and really was able to learn what gains the colleges had from participating in that. And I was am a data coach. I was for 7 years, and now I've returned. That dean job got in the way of continuing, and so I've been doing work with Achieving the Dream now for about 8 years. And there's something that I would like to add to the complexity of the student body, and that is the complexity of mission in community colleges that really does influence student success in a lot of different ways. In both the Rural Community College Initiative and Achieving the Dream, some of the major findings is the need for community colleges to increase their capacity. And their capacity is around leadership, it's around understanding of student success, and it's around resources. And so much of that work is about helping community colleges, how can I put this, alleviating the isolation. Because you have sort of, I think you refer to them as high hitters or high flyer community college, the Valencias, the Miami-Dade. And these are community colleges that do very well, and they're engaged on a national level. The majority of community colleges, I would say, tend to feel isolated. They very seldom attract folks outside their community to work at the college, and therefore their capacity to understand the national conversation and the national issues that are occurring with students is not always there. So there's 2 pieces that I think are really critical that we can discuss, and I'll just kind of throw out there. One is developing the capacity to have useful data in order to use the data to make decisions. Because it's a twofold. We often talk about using data to make the decisions, but at a lot of community colleges, you have to develop the data capacity to begin with. And the second is what I still feel the large divide between research and practice at the community college level. And there are almost 200 coaches with Achieving the Dream, and I think there are 4 or 5 of us that actually work at 4-year institutions. And among those 4 or 5, there's 3 that work at research institutions. So the connecting what is happening around student success research in the community college setting, there's still quite a bit of resistance, and it's not the culture. So I'll put those out as things that we can certainly talk about.
Alphabetical, reverse alphabetical.
Yeah, it's throwing us all for a loop.
So I'm gonna, I know, right? And then the work. Anyway, I'm gonna shift the conversation a touch because so much of what I'm most familiar with right now is thinking about community colleges on a global scale, right? And so we often think of the U.S. the community colleges very college town.
I'm really excited to hear about this.
I know, right? I think we often think of community colleges as a U.S. institution, a U.S. invention, and just deeply American thing. And really, it's in the community college, or as, sort of as the research started calling global counterpart, it's in almost every country in the world, right? So people all around the world are trying to do this thing we call community college, right? And so my particular focus is on India. But I think if we're talking about it on the global scale, it really does tie into this larger, broader picture of student success and completion. And these institutions around the world often look to the US model for ideas of how to do this thing we call community college, especially because what's fairly unique around the world is this transfer function, right? That doesn't really play out very well anywhere, even if it's talked about rhetorically. And so, but now also I know a huge push around the world is around CTE, so career and technical education and workforce development. In India, they always called it skill development. And so there's this understanding that the global economy is shifting, and that particularly in, say, transitioning economies, students have to be educated in a different way, have to be skilled if they're going to participate. Now, that of course opens up all sorts of cans of worms about equity issues and who gets pushed into these workforce development programs. And it was incredibly apparent in India that it was really tied to ancient caste, systems of how professions are thought of and how work is thought of. So that's another piece of this big global perspective on what the function of community college and their global counterparts. And so you can sort of see how it gets really complicated when you think about these big economic factors and this idea of also then within those nations who are saying, oh, the US community college thing, let's sort of try and create something or reform what we have to function that same way. Then you see this whole idea of being educational striving to emulate something outside of what might function well or work well in a national context. And then it often gets what does happen, the indigenous ways of knowing and being often gets ignored when you're striving to try and adapt the US community college model, which is so particular and so unique. And then, complicate that more and say it's not just countries looking to the US, it's also things like India is helping Papua New Guinea develop community colleges, right? So there's also those sorts of lateral exchanges as well. And so you can think about the layers of the interpretation of what it means to be a community college sort of rippling throughout the world. And I think that it also limits, if you're looking to the US as the model, it also limits the US's ability to see what they, or sort of even experience what they could learn from other places that are implementing such programs or such educational sort of arrangements. So in India, for example, because that's where my research, and it's just forgive me, right? I just finished this 3 months ago. So
you take the time you need.
So they're hyper local, right? I always open presentations on Indian community colleges with this picture of a few women, a few kids in this tiny little dirty room. And I'm that is a temple on the side of a mountain where these women walked for miles and brought their kids because their families weren't going to watch them. And they came to learn to sew so that they could earn money to earn decision-making power in their family. Right? And so that's a really different and yet similar, right? If you sort of peel away some layers, idea about the function of the community college in each community. And there were other things, the community colleges went to the students, right? They went to a temple on the side of a mountain rather than saying, you must come to us as a giant institution, right? So it kept it much more flexible. They involved families overall in a way that I don't think our community colleges do or maybe even can. And that may be a contextual issue, but it's also something to think about as we think about the holistic wraparound services that we say are keys to community college student success, especially marginalized students in the U.S. Let's see. So then I guess just the big broad question that I always throw out is like, who is defining student success and to what end? So, right, we think about it as completion often. That's how we define it. Or a good job afterward. But, you know, I always like to complicate it and say, what about like the holistic development of the student and the quality of life of the student? And maybe a good job is doing it. And, you know, if that's what their outcome actually is, that might serve that purpose. But if we're just getting degrees to say check, you know, check that box, I think we're really missing some really an important role that we could be pushing community colleges and their local counterparts to be playing. And so there's this sense of like balancing the incremental and revolutionary change in education, right? Like the incremental, like individual success is super important. I wouldn't want to ever steal that away from a student who gets to go to a community college. And one course can change their whole life, right? But also say, like, let's step back a second and think about how we're positioning community colleges and how we're defining success and who gets to define success and who at least has a voice in defining that success. So.
Awesome.
That's great.
That's great.
So you said one course can change, you mean a statistics course, one statistics course.
It changed my life.
Changed 793, life changer.
Not always in a good way.
Yeah, right. He didn't put that parenthesis. Well, so I'm gonna play off of Peter's, Vasti's, and Jillian's comments a little bit. So first, my work has been, I think, pretty squarely around this notion of success defined as completion, but not to the exclusion of a broader definition of student success. I think Peter's work has helped us. Often community college leaders have said, well, you know, the students don't come here for a degree, they're coming for X, Y, Z. Peter's work around skill builders has started to help us think about how to quantify that. And it's interesting, the international perspective that, you know, there's an emulation of what's going on in the United States, and yet the United States model is deeply flawed as it relates to completion of credentials. And so I'm gonna sort of steal a little bit of Vasti's work as it relates to Achieving the Dream, because what Achieving the Dream did, 2004, 5, so some time ago now, it came out with this notion that student success was defined in a very specific way. It didn't say other definitions of student success were wrong. It just said, look, we've got to work on this piece. We have to work on this piece and help more students get through to a credential. And originally, the early discussion about student success was get to the credential. But to your point, there's got to be some value proposition. And so over time, and I would say probably 2009, 10, folks really started to talk about completion with the degree or certificate having value in the labor market. So there was that sort of addendum to it. But Achieving the Dream was the first initiative that really pushed the community colleges to look inward on themselves and to think about what they as institutions are doing to help their students get beyond just showing up on the first day. They may not know why they're there. They may not know whether or not they're cut out for it, but they're there. Which, you know, all of the other discussions about students that don't show up at higher ed institutions, those are important conversations about access. We're talking about people that have actually shown up, and we have a moral obligation to do something to help them succeed. So Achieving the Dream kind of got that ball rolling. I've been intimately involved in a lot of national initiatives in the last 15 years around this, and it sort of snowballed. Achieving the Dream really took this institutional-wide approach to say, look at yourself. What data do you have? What do you know about your students? But let me sort of pause for a second. Before Achieving the Dream started, I think the impetus for all higher ed to start looking at themselves more critically as it related to graduation and completion came out of the fact that the U.S. Department of Ed started collecting data about graduation rates. Flawed, enormously flawed. We could have a whole conversation about that. But in the late 90s, that's when the U.S. Department of Ed started collecting that data. We started looking not at just community colleges, at all institutions, and quite frankly, well, I think most of our work, you're more involved in 4 years, but most of our work has been in the 2-year sector. Much of what we're talking about here is incredibly applicable to regional universities that are non-selective. So I don't think that we're not limited in that view. But as it relates to the national work in this reform movement that grew over time, Achieving the Dream got us started and really pushed folks to think about, okay, what interventions can you implement to try and move the needle on students' success even in short-term periods. Where it led folks a lot was to focus on, as Peter mentioned, to really focus on developmental education, and academic deficiencies is a major obstacle for depending on where you are, up to 80% of the students that show up. And so from there, you had a national initiative called the Developmental Education Initiative, funded by the Gates Foundation and others, that spurred and certainly helped to disseminate work of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and the Dana Center, which are really focused on thinking about math in a different way and making sure that basically students get the right math at the right time. Not everybody needs algebra. If you're headed to be a history major, don't make math the barrier for that. If you're headed in that, make sure that you're in the right math, and it's not statistics, but it's a calculus-based course. So that was important work. There's also a lot of work going on around what's called the co-requisite model that came out of the Developmental Education Initiative, and the idea that instead of relegating a student to a long sequence of developmental courses and remedial courses, put them in a college level course, give them supplemental support, and help them move further faster. And these strategies we have seen enormous increases in outcomes, and I'll come back to in a minute, but not all colleges are doing it, and not the colleges that are doing it have scaled it to all their students. And an important question is why? What's that?
Capacity.
Well, that's it. That's just, you hit it. So just a couple other quick initiatives that just sort of draw an arc of what's happened. Completion by Design, like Achieving the Dream, was an initiative that was really holistic in its approach. They wanted to look at the entire student experience from the moment of their initial connection with the institution through either graduation and onto a job or transfer to another institution. And the lesson from Achieving the Dream was that isolated interventions may help a set of students in a short period of time, but they didn't hold because they weren't embedded in a larger reform of the entire institution. So Completion by Design sort of played that out, and I'll talk about some statistics from that in a minute. Where we are today is, I think, borrowing from, if you've been watching the news at all about in the last month about all the Nobel Prize winners, Bahr won the Nobel Prize in economics for behavioral economics. And so the work that's happening now, I think prominently in the field, is really around what's referred to as guided pathways, and the idea that we really need to help students make the choices that they want to make, but it has to be better informed. And we're creating sort of the choice architecture that allows them to do it, and thinking about students not only helping them get on the path, but helping them stay on the path, and importantly, making sure that they're learning. But so that's sort of the arc of the reform movement of the last I would say 15 years. The question, as I started to say, is what have we learned, and why aren't all the institutions doing it? Well, often is the case with folks say we don't have evidence. That's actually diminished greatly. There's still lots of things we don't know the answers to, but we know a lot more than we did, particularly for community colleges, but also for the regional universities as well, around reasons why students are falling off and the kinds of things that institutions could do to help retain more students over time. And the Completion by Design colleges, I just want to give you a few statistics, and these data just literally came out this week. Between 2013-14 and 2015-16 academic years, the 9 colleges involved in this national initiative, and these are some high flyers: Miami-Dade, St. Clair in Ohio, Lorain in Ohio, Davidson in North Carolina. I'm not going to remember all 9, but they're high-performing institutions. but they were able to increase the number of students that completed entry-level math in the first year by 10 percentage points over that period of time, on average across all the institutions. Similarly, those over the same period of time, they were able to increase the number of students who were getting at least 12 credits, attaining at least 12 credits by 12% over that same period of time, on average, percentage points. So we're starting to see evidence that this actually can work. And so you start to take away the arguments that we don't have evidence that it can work. And these institutions are very different too. There's some rural institutions. Miami-Dade's the largest community college in the country. They're seeing improvements. They vary individually, but they're seeing improvements on this holistic approach to reform. The other thing I would say is the Aspen Prize in terms of data points. If you haven't read anything about the Aspen Prize and the College Excellence Award that's given out, Lake Area Technical College Institute, which was the 2017 winner, 74% of the first-time full-time students graduate or transfer within three years. 74%. Wow. The national average is 39. What's different? Part of it is their students. They're in CTE programs. They're more structured. I mean, you could almost say that with certainty. Broward College in Florida, St. Pete in southern Florida, South Florida. It's highly diverse. They didn't win. They were finalists with distinction. 50%. Students attained bachelor's degree is at 50%, at a rate 50% higher than the national average. And from Broward, highly diverse institution. So you have very different institutional contexts where you're starting to see these numbers take off. The other thing I'll say, just as a nod to four-year institutions, one of the preeminent examples in improving outcomes and closing attainment and achievement gaps is Georgia State University. And if you haven't learned about Georgia State, you really should, because it's probably the best example of improving outcomes that I know of in any sector. And again, this isn't a setting for PowerPoint, but I think for Pete Rennick they should probably just give him the university, because he's really helped to turn him around. But he's an associate provost that has really shepherded a lot of their work. And I think one of the big shift for them, and it goes back to this question about what data are you using and how are you using it. They were looking for years. Okay, what's their yearly retention rate, year-to-year retention rate, and they were seeing this sort of just 70, 71, 72, 73 for 10, 15 years flat. They're like, well, we're retaining our students. What's going on? Then they started to look at it different, and they started to ask the question, how many of our second-year students have attained sophomore status? And I'm going to love these numbers because I didn't write them down before I came, but somewhere in the ballpark of about 20% of their students, when they first started measuring it, were reaching that milestone of sophomore status by the start of the second year. Their most recent data that I saw just about 3 weeks ago has them at 65% of those students now. And they didn't change their student population. They are a highly diverse, low income, high minority population. They're in downtown Atlanta. They've actually have a reverse achievement gap now because of the work that they've done. And a lot of it, there's a lot of things that went into it. It's the kind of data work that ATD has done, but it's also creating these structured decision-making points and supports for students that is phenomenal. And so that's where the field is going. And I think to just end quickly here, I think Vasti's point about capacity building is precisely what's missing in the field to really help more institutions do something. So I'll stop there.
That's great. That's fabulous. Thank you so much. I probably, had I thought in the moment, I would have, given that we're not too full here, I could have had everyone introduce themselves. And so in the interest of sponsoring conversation, which is what we're striving for here, I think I'm going to go ahead and do that if no one's opposed. To everyone go around. And I know that we are also watching closely, for those who might be tuned in from elsewhere digitally, we're watching closely for your questions. We'd be happy to have you introduce yourselves as well. If you want to post, we will make sure to let people know who you are, but we welcome your questions as well. So let's start to my left and we'll go around, shall we?
Hi, my name's Claire. I'm a first-year doctoral student here at CFHP.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Corker. I'm a first-year master's student.
Hello, I'm Wendy Gillis. I'm a second-year master's student.
Hi, Chelsea Noble. I am a 16 master's alum
And
a first-year doctoral student at Michigan State.
I'm Raul. I'm a second-year doctoral student.
I'm Jackie, and I'm an alumnus of the master's program in 2012, and I am currently working at Berkeley Preparatory School in Florida.
Oh, wow.
I'm Pat King, an 18-year CSHP faculty member.
All right, that's great. So I want to give our audience a chance to field some questions. I have some sort of structured questions that I'm happy to put forward and ask of each of the panelists in turn, and we can open up for questions. But if you have any immediate questions, the audience has any immediate questions, I want to make sure you have an opportunity to ask them now. So they can be specific to a panelist or to the whole panel, or as you like.
Now there's, Jillian, I'm very intrigued based on your description of your study in terms of your example of the community college in the room on the health side and the economic value of that participation. Are there other kinds of community colleges you would contrast those with to show broader kinds of examples and foci, and especially how they're really different from the way they're set up here?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm talking specifically around Indian community colleges, right? So I give that example because it feels like it's on just so far the other end of the spectrum. And community colleges in India, in some ways, like the US, sort of develop as this grassroots movement, right, among educators saying, we need to do something different for our students. Now you can imagine the context is super different, and they only started about 25 years ago in India, 25 years ago in India. And so like the world context, let alone the national context, is really different. But they started as this grassroots movement, and they grow out of that. But because education in India is centralized, there was always this there's a sense of status seeking sort of that permeates, right, the culture. And, you know, again, sort of the caveat of like, yes, I recognize that I'm a white lady doing research in India, right? So not trying to speak as an insider for the culture, right? So this is sort of how I'm sort of seeing what's playing out. So that from the beginning, the folks who were starting community colleges in India were really saying, we've got to get government recognition for these. Otherwise, no matter what we do with these kids, they will never, what they complete, what we give them, the certificate will never have any value outside of maybe the tiny pocket of their home area, which they may never leave, honestly. So it might actually, and that's what they sort of figured out, is that worked out pretty well for these students early on. But because they started trying to get government recognition, it sort of moved from this grassroots movement to this national phenomenon, because you intersected at this time when India is sort of opening up to the world economically and educationally, and really sort of looking at participation in the global economy. And they get this prime minister, and well, pre-Narendra Modi, which is a whole other ball of wax, and how things change with that. But they start really saying, wait, we've really got to skill our student, because they're looking at 1.3 billion people, a tiny percentage of students going in for higher ed. They're looking at a global economy. They're transitioning from agriculture to industrialized or knowledge economy for that matter, and saying, like, what are we going to do with literally all of these people? And so it comes to be partly like the demand increases for higher ed, the need for skilled workers increases, and there's sort of also there's this chatter about like wanting to prevent an Arab Spring in essence, right? So it's almost this tool of
like this tool of pacification.
And so it gets super complicated. I don't even remember what you asked me, Pat.
I can give you an example of South Africa.
Yeah.
Because I did a Fulbright gig in South Africa. And so South Africa had during apartheid, a very structured educational system that was divided up. And post-apartheid, a sector that was never meant to serve adults is now serving a semi-community college function for adults, and that is these technical institutes that were, in South Africa, like the European system, you have sort of the K through whatever it is, primary and secondary, and then they have what is considered college, and it's what we would see as an international baccalaureate, 1 or 2 years, and then you go into university, which is only 3 years. So in this in-between secondary and college were these technical institutes that were meant to be for students who were not academically oriented towards college, and they would go into these technical schools and develop a trade. Well, post-apartheid, combined with this information economy, adults started trying to take classes at these technical institutes, which were not ever really created for adults. It wasn't meant to serve them. So the enrollment in these technical institutes was booming in a way that the government couldn't really pay for one thing, but also not do a quality job, right? And so they became pseudo-community colleges, and at the centralized government level, they were using the American community college as the model as to why this could work, maybe kind of, sort of, but clearly was not. So that's another example of sort of stuff.
Just to there's a 2017 issue of New Directions Community Colleges, and there's a chapter about South African community colleges in it called Global Development of the Community College. So, yeah.
Other questions? Oh, yes, please.
I have lots of questions. I'll start with one.
You have to catch up a little bit, just to catch you on the microphones, wherever they are, someplace in this room.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll just start pointing everywhere. Oh, I see them now. Okay. So the first question is around the definition of student success and how we use research to change the definition of student success. Specifically because I believe the Brookings Institute and the Hamilton Project came out with a study in Florida, actually, that said that people who earn certificates actually earned 96% of what people with bachelor's degree earn. In my mind, that success in income earnings, if you want to talk about economic prospects, but how do you change the social construct of success is gaining a bachelor's degree, and that's the only way, at least in my world, that was the only way to increase economic mobility or social mobility, and changing that aspect of student success.
Well, I'll start off by saying that achieving the dream is backing off on that, the rigid definition of student success for the exact reason you said, and for the kind of data that Pete talked about, because in many ways that skill set person is doing quite well. But also, I want to make clear that after Obama set the big goal of more graduates, the U.S. Department of Education started collecting certificate completers. So it made community colleges do better. It made the United States look better. And so I think that has really provided an impetus for this notion of certificate completion. But state laws still vary greatly. And so some states will not consider that to be a degree. And then there's also financial aid law, which regulations which are beast. But I think that is expanding. And I would also say that the national conversation around student success at the baccalaureate level is not achieving a baccalaureate. It's achieving a baccalaureate in a career-ready major. So, my little liberal arts major is out the window these days. It's not considered student success, even though I tend to think that I'm actually fairly successful. So it is ironic how the culture is actually changing, but not necessarily in the way that's going to benefit student success.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex thing, and I agree with Vasti. I mean, and I think the national agenda around completion, I mean, because we were basically not doing well across the board, it was okay to focus on just like, let's not argue about it, because quite frankly, we have a lot of work to do. That being said, I think everyone has broadened the definition, and they've broadened it to include labor market value in it. And so I think that's all to the good. The challenge becomes when institutions, I mean, and Pete, you may have seen this in your skill builders work, when institutions start to cobble together credits to make something, to check a box on a credential. And there's been some research around, like, some of the credentials, the shorter term credentials are valuable and some of them are not. And so the question isn't, in my mind, isn't one or the other. It's a both and. We need more of all of it. I mean, what all the evidence says is that you're going to have a family sustaining career wage life if you get higher education. And what our job should be as educators is to make sure that the pathway between those credentials is clear. And I was in the last section about scaffolded, and I was in the last session in this room about affordability, and how a key answer to the question about affordability is making sure that students don't lose things they've already earned, whatever those are. And so I think I would discourage a discussion about either or. I think it's a both and, but absolutely agree that we need to broaden that definition.
Can I throw in, even though I'm not a panelist, can I throw in on this, Jillian? Would that be okay? So I think this is really interesting. That was a great question, and I have been thinking about this as well. And I would add 3 pieces here. One of them is that we consider and think about the thoughtful discussion that's happening across the country about the difference between post-secondary certificates and certifications, professional certifications and licenses. Now, those don't have to be distinct necessarily, but it's an area where there's a little bit of confusion has been introduced into the conversation, because certificate, what's a license, what's a certificate? Do you mean post-secondary certificate? Do you mean a certificate issued by some kind of professional body? And then oftentimes, in principle, you should be able to complete a post-secondary certificate on the way to completing the certification for professional organization. And in many, or I don't know about many, but in a number of sectors of employment, it isn't actually the credential that's going to carry the weight, at least initially, for entry into the field. It's that professional certification or license. And the for instance that I use on this is my own experience, one of the things that led me to look at skills builders. I think so probably most people have heard this, but so during my, of course, you know, I was a community college student as well, and I worked my way through undergrad, much like you did, and I did so working as a wastewater treatment plant operator, a sewage treatment plant operator in California, and there, entry into the field is not a baccalaureate degree or an associate degree or a post-secondary certificate. It's a professional certificate. Actually, it's a license, because you can't practice as a wastewater treatment plant operator without a state license called certificate there. And so the ability to advance there, it certainly is assisted. The education is part of meeting the qualifications to advance your license, your certificate. But the certificate itself was what was providing you entree into the field and allowing you to move around the field and increase your earnings and so on. So I think that's an important thing to consider. And there's work happening now. I know you're probably actually helping guide this work with the National Student Clearinghouse and the Manufacturing Institute in Washington, D.C., working to build a national repository, or build on a national repository at the NSC that will include post-secondary certificates and licenses, which is quite exciting. The other thing that I would add to it, now that I've muddied the waters, is that measuring the returns to credentials is a tricky thing indeed. And in my own work, I found that depending on, this is where you get into all sorts of methodological distinctions that are not helpful for communicating in the policy world. As we were talking about at lunch, like how do you get it down into 3 lines? But it turns out that when you, sorry, one line, yeah, 3 lines if you're lucky. 3 lines if the first line was interesting. Part of the complexity is that it's very difficult to disentangle credentials completed by community college students to disentangle the returns to those credentials from the influence of the pathways that students are taking after completing those credentials on their earnings. So initial first blush look at associate degrees can be lower than they might otherwise be, because associate degrees are better, statistically speaking, a better stepping stone to transfer than certificates are. And so you find many more students with associate degrees transfer than those without associate degrees, or than those who have a certificate. And as a result, picking out the earnings gain can be quite delayed. And so some of the work that I've done in this area, and that there's one other, Shanna Jaggers, now at Ohio State, has done some work on measuring returns to credentials that's time sensitive. And when you pull in time sensitivity instead of trying to measure average returns, when you account for things like transfer pathways and how those affect earnings, turns out that yes, certificates provide really strong short-term bump, but that the downward curve on those earnings gains comes much earlier than does an associate degree. Associate degrees, the earnings gains tend to start slower, but they continue to grow for quite a long time. So I think it's important both to look in the short, the medium, and the long term when we talk about returns and how those might be influenced by pathways. And the last thing, this was long, I meant to say 3 quick points, and so I'll stop. The last thing was building on what Chris said about cobbling together credits. I agree, just pulling the credits together is not the right answer, but on the skills builder front, I would never advocate that institutions should stop at saying, well, here, our students are skills builders, and therefore it's okay that our completion rate is low. Actually, identifying the skills builders is just the beginning. It's the beginning of what? It's the beginning of a conversation with students and with employers, with industry, and with the certifying bodies, professional certifying bodies, to understand how can this 6-credit pathway that skills builders pioneered for themselves, that students pioneered for themselves, how can we build on that and communicate to employers the added value of moving, of going beyond the 2 credits, the 2 courses in wastewater treatment, and adding to that now a course in computation, or adding to that a course in composition, because as we move from being a wastewater treatment plant operator to being a wastewater treatment plant manager, you're going to be writing reports, and you're going to be responsible for more mathematics and so on. And so I think that we can add to these pathways in meaningful ways if we will think about how to engage employers and how to engage industry and how to engage students to create something more than just 6 credits, to create a credential completion. That was very long from the moderator. I'm so sorry. Turn back to our panel.
Well, there's one thing I think that's a really important question is how to engage employers in thinking to help the students think beyond their little 6 credits, right? That really do have a return on investment. But I would also, totally lost my train of thought. So I'm going to come back to that, because I think, like Vasti also made a really important point about this shift to a career focus, right? And I think that's really important when you talk about community colleges in the global sphere as well, right? It's like that is the only place that community colleges are growing outside really of the U.S. We are not talking about liberal arts education, and it's actually there's sort of this desire for transfer, but it's like built into this idea, right? And it's built into this idea that we somehow need like PhD welders someday, right? Which is sort of that's always sort of this joke we talk about. Yeah, it's always a joke. They're like, well, wait a minute, let's backtrack on that. We don't maybe need that. But so just thinking about how just dramatically the conversation is shifting in the global sphere about what students need and how to define success for them. And really just this major shift towards career. And it's happening here too, right? For sure. You're pointing out. I completely blanked on what I want. No, whatever.
I want to add one thing.
Yeah.
A lot of the community colleges who are really driving this sort of like, we refuse to have this rigid definition of student success are really the minority serving community colleges. They are really very much resistant to saying that there's only one way to define success. So that's been a big push.
Can I follow up on that? Because that's kind of a thread that I hear going through this, but it hasn't been stated directly. So part of it is what counts as success, but what counts as a success for whom? And, we get at this narrow focus of the jobs we know are there waiting for you in 6 weeks, as opposed to the lifetime skills kind of thing. And then it's like this insidious tracking enters the conversation too, where it's the underrepresented minority students who are encouraged to, attracted to the immediate job part. And it's those who have a little more affluence and a little more flexibility in their education says, well, maybe I need to do some other things with my liberal arts, and then opens up a whole range of career opportunities. So that's a concern. And I assume that as you talk about the caste system in India, is it kind of connected to the caste system in India, apartheid in South Africa, and these contested racial dynamics in the U.S.?
It's a really interesting point. There's a lot baked into that, but
Yes.
You have to overlay the question that the issue you're raising with the context of finance and affordability. I think what's driven us to this notion of what do you get out of it in the short term is the fact that higher ed costs are exorbitant, and states can't afford to support them in the way that they want, and students are rightfully asking questions about, am I getting the return on the investment and how do we default to this really, I won't say easier thing to define of what's the labor market outcome in return versus the societal benefits, the civic value, all of the other benefits of higher education that we know are there that are just much more difficult to quantify. And it feeds into this move back, and certainly in the United States, but elsewhere, about focusing on vocation as opposed to what you're learning and what the values are. So I don't know. I don't know how to disentangle those the funding issues and the costs for students, for states, for like that. Those things it's tough from my vantage point to tear those apart.
I have a not completely different, but slightly different view, for which I have absolutely no other. So let me just kind of clear that. Damn it.
That's all fake.
But I really see students more than willing to engage in the learning process. I think this is a legislatively driven and politically orchestrated push to say that what is valued is career readiness only. And certainly, Florida right now is on steroids on this kick. Yeah. To the point that, the performance metrics talk, average wage of graduates by college. So it's something that I don't think students are engaging in this costs too much and I want a job immediately. I think the majority of students either have an interest in an area or they're pushed in an area. But I think the majority of them, given the opportunity, would actually sit back and test the waters in different areas, but they're not really given the opportunity. In the state of Florida, which of course is where bad policies go to retire, in the state of Florida, you are surcharged if you have excess credit hours more than 10% of your of your degree. And so, if I'm only 10% would be 12 hours. If I'm more than 12 hours, I am paying full freight. I'm not getting state aid, and I'm paying 150% of the cost of tuition. So that pretty much is basically saying you will not explore, you will not do these things. And then institutions are aligning their policies to be with the state legislature. And I shouldn't say that, not all institutions. No, I think the less selective regional institutions are the ones that are struggling.
I think the policy environments that have emerged is reinforcing this for sure. I don't dispute that at all. I think what's interesting around this sort of structure, the guided pathways notion is, I think, I don't know, I'll say this. The fallacy that everybody that shows up at the community colleges wants to do vast exploration or has any bandwidth to understand how to do that exploration. So I think there's something between tracking and unbounded exploration. And I think and I don't know that the balance is struck in terms of this national discussion around guided pathways, but it's not determined choice. It's a guided conversation. And where the colleges, the community colleges, and again, I would say this is probably true of a lot of regional universities, they do a horrible job of helping students do any exploration historically. The high flyers that are getting the numbers I described, they're doing it. They've invested. Miami-Dade hired 25 advisors. And
that's just in the last year.
In the last year and a half, 2 years, something like that. So, because they know that a lot of students are showing up, they may be first generation, no one around them that knows how to navigate an institution. And some of them are showing up with people that are actually hostile to them even doing it. And so what's the obligation of the institutions that are woefully under-resourced in that context? And so the guided pathways is this notion that you're trying to narrow, like how do you set up a structure for you to start to make some kind of decisions? And this notion of meta majors is flawed because you want to be careful not to track people. But it's also helping them decide, okay, if you're going to go into health sciences, you got to be okay with seeing blood. If you're not, it's probably not the course. So let's eliminate that and move into other places. Having those conversations, I think, is really important. But it is fraught with, if you go too far with the idea of tracking and not allowing any exploration. And I don't think that's certainly what I would advocate that.
Well, and I think we should clarify the definition of guided pathway.
Yeah.
Because that may not be what people think it is. I mean, I'm currently working with a college who thinks guided pathways is a program of study. And that's not what it's meant to be. Guided pathways is yes, the program of study is one piece of it, but it's where the entire college is oriented towards the pathway the student should take, and there's not what used to be referred to as the runaround.
That's right.
So guided pathways is a reform of the way the college treats students. Which is,
I think it almost brings us back to your first point about like research versus practice, right? Like this is that the guided pathways are not necessarily being implemented, right? The same way, like you might say to the folks at the college, guided pathways are a much more holistic way of helping students think through a general like career cluster. That's how we call it at OCC, right? But if a counselor is like, I like this pathway and I'm going to put you in that program of study, right? So like the implementation versus dreaming up of and creation of these ideas can be really disconnected.
For sure.
I have a question, but also, so I learned how to weld in high school and college.
Awesome.
So when I get my PhD, will I be a PhD welder?
Absolutely. That is awesome, and yes, absolutely.
And then my question is, the high flyer institutions you're referring to, do they also communicate what college success sort of means to their students? And I asked that question because at the community college I taught at, which by no means represents everything, there were a lot of students who, for them, getting to college was success, and like they didn't think beyond that. Like that was it. So for some students, like, oh, I took a class, I passed it, success. That's not the same thing as thinking about long-term success. So as one of the reasons why those colleges are successful, is that message is carried to the students?
I think it varies from institution to institution, and I think they define it on campus. I mean, I think a lot of them, to sort of make it more generic, I think a lot of them are structuring it around a shared view of what it means to help students get to their educational goal, whatever that might be. And that they have lined up their resources on campus, the pathways, the all-encompassing supports to help students do that, and that they're not getting the runaround. I don't know, Valencia was the first winner of the Aspen Prize.
For the direct connect.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and they're highly, I mean, I don't know what percentage of their students are transfer students, do you know? It's a huge percentage.
It's in the 70s.
Yeah, it's one of the, so they're a very different institution than Lake Area Tech, who 75, 80, maybe even 90% of their students are in career technical programs. So you want to be careful about the definition of student success based on the context of the institution. But Valencia is certainly, I think, a key metric for them is, are they successfully transferring to University of Central Florida?
And it's certainly influenced Central Florida. Slightly over 70% of undergraduates from their College of Education are direct connect students.
Yeah.
So it's affecting institutions.
So I don't know if I answered your question. I'm not sure if I did.
I actually think that part of what you're talking about, because I'm working with some tribal colleges, and during a capacity cafe sort of activity, someone said, if students are not in jail, it's success. So I do think that it's very tempting to sort of break that down, and I'm not sure that we gain anything by not accepting those definitions. So, there's a part of me that's very open to them. But I think those are also examples of the isolation I talked about in capacity, to not envision anything different, or envision things as they've always been. So I think that's that notion of capacity to be able to envision, wow, other people have done this, other institutions have done this, other students have done this.
I feel like that's there's an opportunity to sort of just shift how we do the work, right? Which is celebrating milestones, right? If one class is a success, then that student needs to feel like that's a success, because that's the thing that's going to help that student take the next one and retain, get sophomore status instead of just continue to show up, but continue to accumulate. But I also think then if you're talking about those skill builders, right? And this Pete, I remembered, but I was like, yeah, let's bring those employers in and help start building a program of study for these school builders so they see a pathway to a baccalaureate degree. And so I worry about that arms race that then you put these students in, so that you stop defining skill building as a success on its own, recognizing that not every student wants, needs, cares about getting through to that baccalaureate, even though we say the data tells us that they're going to have better return on better labor market returns in the long run if they do that. Then it just challenges sort of our, right? It asks us to look at our definition of what success means in the United States, for that matter, and say, oh, if we're only measuring it in economic terms, or we're only measuring it in completion terms, and I know there's all these, there's bigger ways to do it. But I think that's a complicated notion about when you invite those employers in, is just making sure that you're still creating success opportunities for folks who don't want to continue.
And I said it before, I think the kind of work that Peter has done to define what that means is really important, because in the past, anybody short of a credential was lumped into that bucket, and we just know that's not true. So I think we're getting better about defining and helping students to define what is their goal at the outset. The challenge, of course, is not forcing them too quickly to define that, and not letting them explore as they should. So.
Do we have other audience questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I'm kind of curious about the role that like administrators and faculty play in all of this. We talked a lot about policy and structures and student affairs professionals and researchers ensuring success for students. But like, what's the role of the administrators and faculty in this work in ensuring success for specifically like transfer students and students of color or any marginalized students in finding success for them and however it's defined whether by them or by the institution.
And the reality is that's the cold face of the institution, to use institutional theory terms, right? Like that's where the rubber meets the road. If the students are having a bad experience with their faculty, it sort of doesn't matter what all these other things are in place, right? So faculty play a critical role. And I think administrators have a long way to go.
Well, I in my experience working with Achieving the Dream, administrators are the ones that struggle to do something different, which always amazes me because I'm like, should be what you are all about. So well, Jillian said that sort of in a funny way. It's very true. And part of it has to do with the historical piece of it. Advisors at community colleges came from counseling. So they saw their role as counseling, not as advising students about their academic progress.
What distinction are you at with that, assuming that the counseling issue was affecting their academic?
So I'll give you some concrete examples from a college. I don't think you'll recognize it. Let me make sure as I'm running through these facts. The counselors did not think that advising needed to be required because there's no way they could have counseling sessions with the number of students that were at that community college, not distinguishing the role that advising it does for academic progress, but only looking at it from a counseling
like a therapeutic, right?
Yes. And I'm not throwing stones. My degree is from a counseling department, so, but it's important to distinguish.
So does it work the other way around? Does those who are trained only as advisors, you look at the courses, you look at the guided pathway, whatever, and miss the like maybe the self-destructive or less success-oriented patterns of behaviors, or just say, gosh, you better go to the counseling center if they recognize that they make a quick referral, which without an incentive to follow up or something. I mean,
well, I do think that some of these professional advisors, I know that a lot of them get hired from in the discipline and don't necessarily have that level of training.
Well, as you know, I mean, I think the short answer to the question is yes. I think you do run that risk, and all the counseling related items and issues that are not going to be related to academic programming necessarily. I mean, you do run the risk of missing that, and that's a growing problem for all of higher ed, I think. To go back to your question about administrators, and if you look at the high flyer, I keep using that word, but if you look at the Aspen finalists and winners, a key variable in all of it is the leadership. And I don't mean the top echelon, I mean the distributed leadership within the institution. And so, I mean, you can go and read more about all of those winners. Those are really hard things to translate, but it does go back very much to Vasti's point about capacity building and how do you translate the success of Valencia's having. Sandy Shugart is absolutely one of the best presidents in the country. There's no question about it. And he's got a super strong team. He's got, I think, a pretty flat organization. The engagement with the faculty is productive and engaged and supportive and collaborative. So those elements around leadership and all its facets is huge. And I think that it certainly relates to faculty, but I mean, the administrators are either going to create or destroy the context and the culture that allows for that.
And that's true in sort of any organizational change or organizational reform effort, right? It's like take it to like how are part-time faculty treated, right? If you want to create an environment where part-time faculty are included in the sort of ethos of the college and the culture of the college, it takes administrative like buy-in, it takes administrative leadership, and that's true. That's just one other aspect. So I think that's always a common thread in organizational change and reform. Is like the leadership has got to be strong and committed and be willing to create champions across the organization.
The thing that's different in the last 10 years, I would say, and Achieving the Dream deserves a ton of credit for this, is the use and the culture around data and evidence. If you went to most community college campuses 15 years ago, very few of them may have even had an IR office.
To be honest with you, even 4-year institutions, 25 years ago.
I've focused on community college. No,
right.
fair.
Community college issue. I mean, I think higher education is really, as an enterprise, struggles with innovation and change.
I'm going to shift us. We have 6 minutes left. That clock's correct. It's close. I'm going to shift us, and this might not work. We'll see. So I am going to field out some questions here, specific questions, and I will ask each of our panelists to answer in 60 seconds or less.
Okay.
That for you. No pressure. I'm sorry.
Is this the lightning round?
This is the lightning round. That's exactly right. What is your quest?
Reverse order alphabetically again.
That's What is your quest? What is your favorite color? Ooh, no yellow. All right. First question, focusing on community colleges and other non-selective or less selective institutions. In the absence of the ability to hire funding, in the absence of funding to hire a number of additional advisors, what is one thing that institutions can do to, and I'll go to Chris first, because he used the phrase guided conversation, which I thought was helpful, to encourage or strengthen a, quote, guided conversation, unquote, with students that will avoid tracking, but steer students away from unproductive, unbounded exploration to increase completion. Go.
And late registration.
And late registration. Why end late registration?
Because you're not going to have conversations with students that show up late. You're just not going to do it. And community college students are notoriously, historically, showing up late to register.
That's, wow. You rock. That was fast. Jillian?
I'm still thinking we're past it. I would say that the work is meaningless or in the margins unless you deal with the faculty in the classroom. So the hiring of faculty has to change in order to make that level.
In what way change?
Like one college that I visited had this whole series of essays that any applicant had to submit that were focused on student success, philosophy of teaching, what the role of community in the classroom, things like that that were much more oriented towards the kind of faculty, hopefully, that would do those things for the community college.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. Jillian?
Yeah, I think orienting faculty to this notion, right, is helping them not see themselves as content experts, but think of themselves as like, I don't want to say student development because that opens a can of worms, but like human development, right? Like that's their work. It's not just delivering content, but their role is orienting we need to orient faculty to that notion that like students are showing up with a lot of stuff in their classroom. And if we really want to help students be successful in a broad definition of success, faculty have to see themselves that way.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Okay, next. That was great. That's really good. Question number 2. In a minute or less, what role or responsibility? Oh no, here, this was better. What is the most promising under-adopted practice or intervention by under adopted, I mean a promising practice or intervention that institutions have not adopted on a wide scale, and how can scalability of that intervention be achieved?
Co-curricular. Using developmental
Do what?
courses using remedial developmental courses in a co-registration with the college.
Okay.
The data is there.
It's so
the data
clear.
is so clear. And yet it's not widely.
Playing on this relatedly is coupled with the co-rec model, the placement policy should use multiple measures.
I agree with you on that, yeah. Multiple measures placement, meaning relying on things like
Not just a cut score on a placement test, but using GPA and
inaccurate placement.
and other measures to determine the level of readiness.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I'm sticking with co-recs.
All right. How about this? What role or responsibility was stuff? What would you say is the institution's primary responsibility with respect to elevating students' goals and ambitions, if any? What would you say is the institution's primary role or responsibility with respect to elevating students' goals and ambitions?
I make Jillian go first.
Yeah, I'm arguing with that. I don't like, for me, I don't like the way the question's phrased, because I don't.
Originally it was what role as opposed to.
Well, I think there's an assumption in the question that says students' goals have to be elevated.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sort of quibbling with that.
Great.
As appropriate?
Right, sure, as appropriate. But I think, Pat, that's the point. The question is being asked by research, right? Like, if that's the question, is researchers we're asking, that's informing the data that we're collecting, the interpretation we're making of the data. So I'm actually saying, like, hey, as researchers, we need to rethink how we're framing the question we're asking. Right.
Okay.
I got my 60 seconds in.
That's great.
Actually, I'm going to use something that Achieving the Dream started in the early 2000s, not 200, 2000.
Feels like it.
And that is institutions cannot blame the student.
Yeah.
That in not blaming the student, the institution has to think about what can I do to help the student versus saying, we have this problem because our students are blank.
Yeah. That's good.
Gosh.
That's good. Marcia Ballinger is the president, used to be provost, now president of Lorain County. Definitely a high flyer. She says, I think it originated with her. I heard her say it, so I say it's from her. But she has flipped the moniker about being college ready to are the institutions student ready, and
Yeah.
I think it is a fundamental mindset shift about the obligation institutions have. Look at all survey data. The survey data around student intent says something somewhere in the ballpark. It says 75% of students want to get a bachelor's degree.
Right.
Whether or not that's an informed point of view, I don't know. But we are way away from that number.
Right.
Yeah.
And so to me, that says we do have an obligation to be really clear about helping them understand what their goals are.
Right.
Not telling them what they should be, but helping them understand what they are. We have a substantial obligation to do that.
There's a relatively new book by that title. I actually just bought it, it was in the semester. It's called Being a Student Ready College.
Oh, really?
Or Becoming a Student Ready College. So it's that thing.
Okay.
I am just thrilled with our panel. I'm so thrilled. You guys did such a good job. Vasti and I did Rochambeau to decide who would be on the panel and who would be the moderator. And you guys just did an outstanding job. So that definitely, the audience won for how that Rochambeau turned out. Thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you also to the audience. And I'm sorry that I'm sure we did not get to every question, but thank you for joining us. I'm really excited. I'm pleased too with sort of our size. This dynamic worked really well. And to those who tuned in from elsewhere, thank you for joining us. And yeah, this is great. It's really good. Thank you all. That'll conclude us.
Thanks.